For as long as anyone in the galaxy could remember, two colossal empires had been locked in a brutal, unending war. The Draenith Empire, known for its powerful warships and overwhelming firepower, had been fighting the Xylorian alliance for centuries. The Xylorians, with their advanced energy weapons and massive fleets, refused to surrender. Entire star systems had been destroyed, reduced to nothing but floating debris and lifeless planets. Both sides were determined to win, but neither could gain the upper hand. The galaxy watched in horror as the war dragged on. Planets that once flourished with life and trade now stood as graveyards, silent witnesses to the destruction that the Draenith and Xylorians brought with them. Civilians lived in fear, wondering if their world would be the next to fall victim to the endless conflict. On the battlefield, the war had become a game of numbers. The Draenith would send wave after wave of their massive warships, each one larger than the last. The Xylorians responded with fleets of their own, their ships equipped with the most advanced energy shields known in the galaxy. Battles would last for days, sometimes weeks, with no clear victor. Both sides had long since lost count of how many ships and soldiers they had sacrificed. It didn't matter anymore. Victory was all that mattered. The Galactic Council, a group of neutral civilizations that had stayed out of the conflict, had tried to broker peace many times. But every attempt had ended in failure. The Draenith were too proud, and the Xylorians were too stubborn. They had been enemies for so long that neither side could imagine peace anymore. The war raged on. Both empires began to run out of resources. Planets that were once rich in minerals and energy were now depleted. The Draenith and Xylorians started to look for new ways to turn the tide of the war in their favor. Rumors spread that each side was working on a secret weapon, something that would finally give them the power to destroy their enemy once and for all. In the midst of this chaos, a small, unnoticed species had been watching from the sidelines. The humans, who came from a distant corner of the galaxy, had managed to stay out of the war, choosing instead to focus on building their own technology and advancing their society. They had no interest in fighting the Draenith or Xylorians. But that didn't mean they weren't paying attention. The human leaders watched as the war tore the galaxy apart. They studied the tactics of both sides, quietly observing the strengths and weaknesses of the Draenith and Xylorian forces. The humans knew they were far smaller than either of the warring empires, but they had something the others didn't: an ability to adapt quickly and a determination to survive. While the Draenith and Xylorians continued to throw more ships and soldiers into the war, the humans developed new technologies in secret. Their scientists worked tirelessly to create weapons and defenses that were far more advanced than anything the Draenith or Xylorians had. They didn't want to fight, but they knew that one day they might have One day, a human reconnaissance ship was sent to observe one of the largest battles yet. A massive Draenith fleet had engaged with an equally large Xylorian armada in a star system near the edge of known space. The battle had been going on for weeks, with no end in sight. Both sides had suffered heavy losses, but neither was willing to retreat. The humans watched from a distance, their ship cloaked by advanced stealth technology. They could see the destruction up close, the burning wreckage of ships, the scattered debris, and the desperate maneuvers of both sides as they tried to gain the upper hand. It was clear that neither side had learned anything from centuries of war. They were both stuck in the same old tactics, relying on brute force rather than strategy. The humans continued to observe. A message was sent to both the Draenith and Xylorian leaders. It was a simple offer: peace. The humans offered to mediate a ceasefire and help negotiate a solution that would end the war for good. The response came quickly, and it wasn't what the humans had hoped for. Both the Draenith and Xylorians rejected the offer outright. In fact, they both found the idea laughable. Who are these humans, they thought, to interfere in our war? They are a small, insignificant species. They have no place in our galaxy-wide conflict. The human leaders weren't surprised by the reaction, but they knew they had to try. The galaxy couldn't survive much longer if the war continued. Still, they understood that diplomacy had failed, and now they had to prepare for a different approach. Back on Earth, the human military began to mobilize. Ships that had been hidden in secret shipyards were brought to the forefront. Soldiers trained in new advanced combat techniques were readied for deployment. The humans didn't want to fight, but they knew that the time was coming when they would have no choice. The Draenith and Exilorians continued their battle, unaware of what was about to happen. Both sides were so focused on destroying each other that they failed to see the real threat approaching from the edge of the system. The human fleet, smaller in number but far more advanced, moved into position. It was a gamble. The humans knew they were outnumbered, but they also knew that they had something the Draenith and Exilorians didn't: new technology that could turn the tide of the war in a matter of hours. As the human fleet approached the battlefield, the leaders of both the Draenith and Exilorians received another message. This time, it was a warning. "Stand down," the message said, "or be destroyed." The aliens ignored the warning. After all, what could these humans do against their massive fleets? They were too small, too weak to make any difference in this war. But they were wrong. The humans, armed with advanced AI systems, drones, and weapons that could disable entire fleets in seconds, were about to change the course of the war forever. The galaxy had no idea what was coming, but soon they would learn that underestimating the humans was the biggest mistake the Draenith and Exilorians had ever made. The battle between the Draenith Empire and the Exilorian Alliance had reached its peak. Both sides were locked in a deadly stalemate, with their warships exchanging powerful energy blasts that lit up the dark expanse of space. Explosions erupted as ships were torn apart, their pieces scattered across the battlefield. Neither side showed any sign of retreat. Suddenly, without warning, something strange happened. From the far edge of the system, a new fleet appeared. It was small compared to the massive armadas of the Draenith and Exilorians, but there was something about it that made everyone take notice. The ships were sleek, dark, and moved with an eerie precision. Their technology was unlike anything either empire had ever seen before. The Draenith commander, Admiral Kor, squinted at the display on his command ship. His eyes narrowed as he studied the new arrivals. "What is this?" he growled. "More enemies?" His second-in-command, Lieutenant Vrax, looked just as confused. "I don't recognize the ships, sir. They don't match any known faction." Admiral Kor grunted in frustration. He wasn't in the mood for surprises. His fleet was barely holding its own against the Exilorians. They didn't need another threat. Meanwhile, on the Exilorian flagship, Captain Quolor watched the new fleet with growing suspicion. "Those ships. They move too smoothly," he muttered. "This isn't an ordinary fleet." His tactical officer nodded. "Their technology looks advanced. Should we engage?" "No," Captain Quolor said firmly. "Not yet. Let's see what they do first." Both sides held their fire as the mysterious fleet advanced. Slowly, the ships moved into the center of the battlefield, right between the Draenith and Exilorian forces. For a moment, there was silence. The humans had arrived. On board the lead human ship, Commander Sarah Hawkey stood on the bridge, her hands clasped behind her back as she stared out at the massive fleets before her. She knew this moment would be tense. The humans had stayed hidden for so long, watching the war from the shadows. Now, they were revealing themselves, and it wasn't going to be peaceful. "Send the message again," Commander Hawk ordered calmly. Her communications officer nodded and transmitted the warning: "Stand down. End the fighting, or face the consequences." The message echoed across the battlefield, reaching both the Draenith and Exilorian command ships. Admiral Kor barked out a laugh when he heard it. "Who do they think they are?" he scoffed. "They must be insane if they think we'll just stop fighting because they told us to." Captain Quolor wasn't so quick to dismiss the message. He frowned as he studied the human ships. "I don't know," he muttered to himself. "There's something off about this." Neither side had any intention of backing down. The Draenith and Exilorians had been at war for centuries. They weren't about to let a small, unknown fleet tell them what to do. Both commanders gave the same order: attack the intruders. The human fleet, though vastly outnumbered, was ready. As soon as the Draenith and Exilorian ships opened fire, the humans responded with unmatched precision. In a flash, the human ships launched hundreds of drones, small, fast, and highly advanced machines designed for both offense and defense. They zipped through space, dodging enemy fire with ease, and targeted the weak points of the alien ships. The Drannith and Excelorians were caught off guard. Their weapons were powerful, but they were old and outdated compared to the human technology. The drones unleashed a barrage of attacks, disabling shields, engines, and weapon systems in mere seconds. Ship after ship went dark, their power systems fried by the human assault. On the Drannith flagship, Admiral Kor's jaw dropped in shock as he watched his fleet fall apart. "Impossible!" he roared. "How are they doing this?" Captain Qualler was equally stunned. "This can't be happening," he whispered. "Their ships are too fast. Too advanced." The humans didn't stop there. As the drones continued their assault, the human warships unleashed a new kind of weapon, electromagnetic pulses, that crippled the enemy ships without destroying them. It was a display of overwhelming power, but also of restraint. The humans had the ability to annihilate both fleets, but they chose to disable them instead. Within minutes, the battle was over. The Drannith and Excelorian fleets were left floating, powerless, in the void of space. Their weapons, shields, and engines had been completely neutralized. On the human flagship, Commander Hawk watched the scene unfold with a calm, steady gaze. She had expected resistance, but the speed of their victory was still surprising. The war had raged on for centuries, and yet, in just a matter of hours, the humans had stopped it in its tracks. "Send the message again," she ordered. The communications officer nodded and transmitted the final warning. "This war is over. You can no longer fight. Accept peace or face destruction." The Drannith and Excelorian commanders were silent. For the first time in centuries, they didn't know what to do. The humans had taken control of the battlefield, and now they had to decide whether to keep fighting or to finally end the war. The battlefield was a graveyard of disabled ships. The Drannith and Excelorian fleets, once fierce and dominant, now floated aimlessly, their systems completely shut down by the humans' advanced technology. The silence in space was almost eerie after the chaos that had erupted just minutes earlier. On the human flagship, Commander Sarah Hawk stood tall on the bridge, her face calm but focused. She knew what was coming next. The Drannith and Excelorians were not just going to roll over and accept defeat, even though they had no other choice. History had shown that these empires were stubborn, proud, and willing to fight until the bitter end. "Are they responding?" she asked her communications officer, a young lieutenant who was typing furiously at his console. "Not yet, Commander," he replied, "but we're picking up chatter on their internal channels. They're trying to figure out what to do." Commander Hawk nodded, knowing the time was running out. The humans had made their move, and it was time to show the galaxy that they meant business. But even in the face of their overwhelming victory, there was no celebration among the humans. This was not a mission to conquer. It was a mission to end the senseless violence that had plagued the galaxy for too long. "Keep monitoring," she ordered. "We'll give them a few more minutes. But if they refuse, we will escalate." Meanwhile, aboard the Drannith flagship, Admiral Kor was pacing back and forth, his anger boiling over. His once powerful fleet had been brought to its knees by an enemy he had never even heard of until today. He slammed his fist onto the console in frustration. "Curse those humans," Kor spat. "How dare they interfere in our war? We can't let this stand." Lieutenant Vrex, his second-in-command, tried to stay calm, though the fear in his voice was clear. "Admiral, we don't have much of a choice. Our ships are disabled, and we have no way to fight back. We need to surrender." Kor's face twisted with fury. "Surrender? To humans? Never. I'd rather see this entire fleet burn before I give in to them." But even Kor knew that he was out of options. The Drannith fleet was helpless, and the human ships loomed over them like predators circling their prey. He had fought in dozens of battles, but never had he seen such an overwhelming show of force. The humans had neutralized his entire fleet in a matter of minutes without breaking a sweat. Across the battlefield, on the Excelorian command ship, Captain Kaller was watching the situation with a mix of awe and fear. He had always prided himself on being a rational leader, and now logic told him that there was only one path forward. "We can't win this," Kaller said quietly to his tactical officer. The humans. They have power beyond anything we've ever seen. If we continue to resist, we're doomed. His tactical officer hesitated, but eventually nodded. You're right, Captain. We need to end this before they destroy us. Queller took a deep breath and made his decision. He activated the communication system and opened a channel to the human fleet. Commander Hawk's face appeared on the screen, calm and unreadable. This is Captain Queller of the Exilorian command ship, he said. We are prepared to negotiate a ceasefire. Commander Hawk tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the statement. Good. But a ceasefire is not enough. This war must end. Your people and the Draneth have been tearing the galaxy apart for far too long. If you don't agree to peace, we will take more drastic measures. Queller's stomach churned at the thought of what drastic measures might mean. The humans had already shown that they could disable entire fleets with ease. He had no doubt that if pushed, they could destroy them just as easily. I understand, Queller said, his voice steady. I will contact my government immediately. We want peace. Hawk's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. You have 1 hour. If you do not agree to unconditional peace, we will take action. The transmission ended and Queller slumped back in his chair. He had done what he could, but the fate of his people now rested in the hands of the Exilorian High Council. On the Draneth flagship, however, Admiral Kor was far from ready to surrender. Despite the overwhelming odds, his pride refused to let him back down. He activated his communication system and opened a channel to the human fleet. This is Admiral Kor of the Draneth Empire, he growled. You may have disabled our ships, but we are far from defeated. If you think we'll bow to your demands, you're gravely mistaken. Commander Hawk listened calmly, but there was no sympathy in her voice as she responded. You have 1 hour, Admiral. After that, you won't have a choice. With that, the humans cut the transmission, leaving Kor fuming on his bridge. He had never felt so powerless, and it burned him to his core. As the clock ticked down, the tension across the battlefield grew. The humans had made their move, and now the galaxy waited to see what would happen next. Would the Draneth and Exilorians finally lay down their arms? Or would humanity have to unleash the full force of its power to end the war once and for all? The 1-hour deadline given by the humans was rapidly approaching, and across the Draneth and Exilorian fleets, tension hung like a dark cloud. On every ship, officers anxiously awaited orders from their leaders, unsure of what would come next. The galactic war had raged for centuries, but never before had they faced anything like this, an enemy so advanced that they could end the conflict with a single command. On the human flagship, Commander Sarah Hawkey stood in silence, watching the massive display screen on the bridge. The countdown timer showed that only minutes remained. Her crew worked diligently, monitoring the situation, preparing for any possible outcome. They knew the humans held all the cards, but even with their overwhelming advantage, Commander Hawk preferred peace over destruction. Any word from the Draneth? She asked, turning to her communications officer. The young officer shook his head. None, Commander. Admiral Kor is refusing to surrender. He's still rallying his fleet. Hawk sighed softly. Admiral Kor's pride would be his downfall. She had seen this kind of stubbornness before, leaders clinging to power, refusing to admit defeat until it was too late. But she had no intention of letting this war drag on. Humanity had stepped in to stop the senseless bloodshed, and if Kor continued to resist, she would not hesitate to neutralize his forces. What about the Exilorians? Hawk asked. We received a message from Captain Queller. He's negotiating with his government, trying to convince them to accept the peace terms. It seems they're more open to diplomacy, the communications officer replied. Good, Hawkey said. We'll give them time. But if Kor doesn't stand down, we'll have to make an example of him. As the minutes ticked by, the Draneth fleet began to prepare for the worst. Admiral Kor was not one to back down easily. On his command ship, the atmosphere was tense. Every officer knew that their fate was hanging by a thread, but Kor's iron will keep them in line. We will not surrender to these humans. Kor barked. They think they can waltz in here and dictate terms? They're nothing compared to the might of the Draneth Empire. His officers exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared speak out. Kor's reputation as a ruthless leader kept them in check. Still, many knew deep down that their situation was hopeless. The humans had demonstrated power far beyond anything they had ever seen. Resistance seemed futile. Admiral Lieutenant Vrax, Kor's second-in-command, finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Perhaps we should reconsider. If we continue to fight, we'll be destroyed. Our ships are already disabled, and the humans, enough?" Kor slammed his fist on the console. "I will not listen to cowardice. We are Draneth. We do not surrender." But Vrax could no longer stay silent. "Admiral, with all due respect, this is not about pride. This is about survival. We can't win this. The humans are offering peace. If we don't take it, they'll wipe us out." Kor's eyes blazed with fury, but even he could not deny the truth. His fleet was crippled, and the humans had given them a way out. But surrendering felt like an insult to everything he stood for. He had fought his entire life to protect the Draneth Empire, and now, in the face of an unstoppable force, he felt powerless. Before Kor could respond, a warning alarm blared across the bridge. The main screen lit up with a new development. Human warships were repositioning, moving into strategic attack formations. "They're preparing for an assault," one of the officers shouted. Kor's heart raced. This was it. The humans had run out of patience. Meanwhile, on the Excelorian command ship, Captain Kohler's efforts were finally bearing fruit. After hours of tense discussions with the Excelorian High Council, they had agreed to the human terms. Peace was the only logical choice. "Captain," one of his officers reported, "the Council has accepted. We're sending our official surrender to the humans." Quayler breathed a sigh of relief. It wasn't a victory, but at least his people would survive. He immediately sent a transmission to the human flagship. "Commander," the communications officer said, "we've just received a message from the Excelorians. They've agreed to the peace terms." Commander Hawk smiled slightly. "Good. At least someone in this war has some sense." But her expression quickly hardened as she turned her attention back to the Draneth fleet. "What about Kor?" Still no response, the officer replied grimly. "They're preparing for battle." Hawk's face darkened. She had hoped to avoid this, but Admiral Kor had left her no choice. She opened a direct channel to the Draneth flagship. "Admiral Kor," her voice was calm but cold, "this is your final warning. Stand down now, or we will engage." On the Draneth bridge, Kor clenched his fists, his eyes burning with defiance. He stared at the screen, at the human commander who held his fate in her hands. For a moment, he hesitated. His officers looked at him, waiting for his decision. But Kor's pride would not allow him to back down. "Do your worst, human," he snarled. "The Draneth Empire will never bow to your kind." With a heavy heart, Commander Hawk gave the order. "All ships, target the Draneth fleet. Engage." In seconds, beams of energy and missiles rained down on the Draneth fleet. But this was not the kind of brutal warfare the galaxy was used to. Humanity had evolved beyond mere destruction. Their weapons were designed to disable, not annihilate. Within moments, the Draneth ships were rendered completely powerless. Shields collapsed, engines failed, and weapons systems went offline. The once mighty Draneth fleet was now nothing more than a collection of floating debris, helpless in the face of humanity's superior technology. Admiral Kor watched in stunned silence as his fleet was neutralized without a single shot fired in retaliation. His pride had led him here, and now there was no escape. "It's over," Lieutenant Vrax whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Kor sank into his chair, defeated. The war, as he had known it, was over. The galaxy would never be the same again. Back on the human flagship, Commander Hawk stood tall, her eyes fixed on the now disabled Draneth fleet. There was no joy in victory, only relief. The senseless conflict had come to an end. "Send out the peace terms to all remaining forces," she ordered. "The war is over." But even as the humans secured peace, they knew this was only the beginning. A new era of warfare had dawned, one where power was not measured by destruction, but by control. And humanity, with its advanced technology and strategic brilliance, had just shown the galaxy that they were unmatched in both. As the Draenith and Exilorian fleets lay crippled, drifting in the aftermath of humanity's overwhelming display of power, an urgent message was sent out across the galaxy. The ancient rivals, once bitter enemies locked in endless warfare, now had no choice but to reconsider their path. The humans had shown them the futility of their conflict, but more importantly, they had demonstrated that an alliance was now their only hope for survival. On the capital planet of the Exilorian homeworld, the Galactic Council gathered for an emergency session. Representatives from both the Draenith and Exilorian empires, alongside smaller factions caught in the crossfire, convened to discuss one simple question: how could they defeat an enemy that was unbeatable? Captain Collar, the Exilorian officer who had been negotiating with humanity, was among the few in favor of surrender. He had seen firsthand the might of the human fleet, their effortless ability to disable entire armadas without breaking a sweat. But others in the council were less willing to accept defeat. The humans are not invincible, Admiral Kor bellowed, his voice booming through the grand hall. He stood tall, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the other representatives. His pride was still wounded from the recent humiliation, and the thought of bowing to humanity disgusted him. "We cannot let them dictate the terms of peace," Kor continued. "If we do, we'll be no better than slaves under their control. We must fight back together. If the Draenith and Exilorians unite, we can find a way to defeat them." Queller sighed quietly. He admired Kor's determination, but it was misplaced. "Admiral," he began carefully, "we've seen their strength. This isn't a war we can win with brute force. They are far beyond anything we've encountered. Even our combined fleets won't stand a chance." The council room erupted in arguments, voices overlapping as representatives debated their next move. Some were in favor of Kor's call to arms, desperate to regain their honor and refuse submission. Others, like Queller, believed an alliance with humanity rather than against them was the only path to lasting peace. But one thing was clear: the Draenith and Exilorian empires could no longer afford to fight each other. After centuries of bloodshed, the endless galactic war was coming to an end, not because of diplomacy or peace talks, but because of a new, more powerful force. Humanity had forced them into a corner, and now their survival depended on unity. Back on the human flagship, Commander Sarah Hawk received word of the council's meeting. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the report with a sense of satisfaction. The seeds of peace were taking root, though they were still fragile. "They're considering an alliance," her first officer, Lieutenant Carter, reported. "But it's not what we hoped for. Kor is pushing for them to fight back." Hawk raised an eyebrow. "Kor, again. That man's ego is bigger than the entire Draenith Empire." Carter smirked. "No doubt. But there are voices of reason. Captain Queller is trying to steer them toward diplomacy. He knows they can't win a war against us." Hawk nodded thoughtfully. "Still, we can't let this get out of control. If they try to form a military alliance against us, things will escalate quickly. We need to make sure they understand that resistance is not an option." She stood up and paced across the bridge, thinking through her next move. An alliance was inevitable, but it had to be on humanity's terms. If the Draenith and Exilorians wanted to work together, it would have to be as allies of Earth, not enemies. "Send another message to the Council," Hawkeye ordered. "Remind them of our offer of peace. If they choose to fight, we won't hold back next time." Back at the Council, Kolor stood up, his voice rising above the chaos. "Enough!" he shouted, silencing the room. "We can argue all we want, but the truth is staring us in the face. The humans are giving us a way to end this war, to save our people from total destruction." He turned to Kor, meeting the Admiral's fierce gaze. "You're right about one thing, Kor. We can't let the humans control us. But the way to prevent that isn't by fighting them, it's by working with them. We need to forge an alliance, not as their subordinates, but as equals. If we stand together, we might have a chance at shaping the future rather than being crushed by it." The room was quiet, the weight of Kohler's words sinking in. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the endless war could finally come to an end. And with humanity at their side, the galaxy could move into a new era of cooperation and peace. Admiral Kor's fists clenched at his sides. He hated the idea of submission, of bending to another's will. But deep down, even he knew that Kolar was right. If they didn't unite with the humans, they would be wiped out. And so, begrudgingly, Kor nodded. "The Draneth will consider the terms," he said, his voice strained. And with that, the galaxy's most desperate alliance was born not out of loyalty or friendship, but out of sheer necessity. Together, they would face the future. Together, they might survive. The galaxy was on the brink of a new chapter. The desperate alliance between the Draneth and Exilorian empires and the humans had finally come together. But time was not on their side. They had learned the hard way that hesitation could lead to annihilation. With the combined fleets ready, a plan was set in motion, one that would change the course of history. Commander Sarah Hawk stood on the bridge of the human flagship, the Resolute. The atmosphere was tense. Officers moved briskly, preparing for what was being called the final engagement. The Council's agreement to unite forces against the last remnants of the Draneth and Exilorian fleets was a necessary step, but it also meant they would face a formidable opponent. The human ships formed up with the Draneth and Exilorian vessels. Hawk addressed the commanders of both empires. "We are here today because we share a common goal. Together, we will end this war once and for all. But we must work in unison. Follow my orders, and we will show the galaxy that peace can be achieved." Admiral Kor and Captain Queller stood beside her, their faces set in grim determination. They nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Kor's bravado had faded, replaced by a shared fear of what was to come. They had witnessed humanity's might and knew they needed to rely on them now. The plan was simple yet effective. The Resolute would take the lead, using its advanced targeting systems to disable key enemy ships. The Draneth and Exilorian fleets would provide cover and support, attacking any ships that tried to flank them. Each commander knew their role, and they were ready to put their trust in one another. As they approached the battlefield, the communication lines buzzed with activity. Hawkeye looked at her screen, watching as the enemy ships scattered in anticipation of the impending attack. "Prepare to engage," she commanded. The crew responded with efficiency born of urgency. "Enemy fleet is in sight," the sensor officer called out. "They're preparing for defense." "Let them come," Kor sneered, his confidence returning. "They will be surprised by our numbers." Hawk held up her hand. "This isn't about pride, Admiral. Remember what we are fighting for." She felt the weight of leadership heavy on her shoulders. Today was not just about victory, it was about proving that unity could lead to peace. With a roar, the Resolute fired the first shots. Bright beams of energy shot out, striking the nearest Draneth ships. The enemy was caught off guard, their formations breaking as panic swept through their ranks. The humans had launched a surprise attack, and they were not holding back. Within moments, the combined might of the Draneth and Exilorian fleets surged forward, joining the fray. Kor and Queller shouted commands to their respective crews, directing their ships to target key enemy vessels. The battlefield lit up with explosions, the sounds of war echoing in space. But just as it seemed the tide was turning, a second wave of Draneth fighters appeared from a nearby moon. They had been lying in wait, hoping to ambush the Alliance. Hawk's heart raced as the alert sirens blared across the Resolute. "Incoming fighters! All hands, battle stations!" she shouted. The chaos unfolded around them. Ships clashed in a spectacular display of fire and fury. But amid the chaos, the human tactics shone through. The training they had undergone, their innovation, and their adaptability set them apart. They worked as one, maneuvering and striking with precision. As the battle raged on, Hawk noticed something surprising. The Draneth and Exilorian fighters were starting to hesitate. They weren't fighting with the same ferocity as before. It was as if the spirit of their earlier conflicts had vanished. Hawk realized that fear had replaced anger. They were no longer fighting to win, but merely to survive. "Look," Carter shouted from the console. "Their formations are breaking apart. Hawk glanced at the screen. The Draneth and Excelorian ships were indeed faltering, their commanders overwhelmed by the combined human tactics and firepower. Kor's eyes widened in realization. "They're giving up," he exclaimed. With a final push, the Resolute and its allies pressed on. The remaining enemy ships, once proud and fierce, began to surrender. The sight was astonishing. In just a matter of hours, the war that had raged for generations was coming to an end. The Draneth and Excelorian empires had fought valiantly, but the unity they had forged with humanity had proven too powerful. Hawk ordered a ceasefire. "Send out messages of surrender. Tell them we offer terms of peace, not more violence," she instructed. Her heart swelled with pride. They had done it. They had not only won a battle, but had also secured a future. The communications officer responded with a nod. "Sending messages now." As the last ships of the Draneth and Excelorian fleets lowered their weapons, the bridge erupted in cheers. Kor and Queller exchanged glances, understanding the significance of this moment. They had set aside centuries of conflict to forge a new path, one that might finally lead to peace. As the ships settled into a new formation, ready to escort the defeated enemies home, Hawk reflected on what had just happened. The galaxy had witnessed the end of an era. Together, they had turned the tide in hours, showcasing the power of collaboration. The war was over, but a new journey was just beginning. The alliance between humans, Draneth, and Exilorians would pave the way for rebuilding, for understanding, and for a future where the scars of war could heal. They had chosen cooperation over conflict, and that choice would echo through the ages. And in that moment, Commander Sarah Hawkey knew they had created something far more valuable than victory. Hope. In the days following the end of the war, the galaxy buzzed with excitement and uncertainty. The peace treaty between the Draneth, Exilorian, and human empires had been signed. Leaders from all three races gathered on the neutral planet of Zenthara to discuss a new future. This was no ordinary gathering. It was a chance to shape a new order in the galaxy. Commander Sarah Hawk stood at the center of the Grand Hall, her heart racing. The room was filled with representatives from each empire, all eager to share their visions. The air was thick with anticipation. Could they truly build a new alliance after so much conflict? As she looked around the room, she noticed the mix of hope and caution on everyone's faces. The Draneth were tall and proud, their sharp features a reminder of their warrior past. The Exilorians, known for their cunning and agility, moved gracefully, their eyes reflecting curiosity. And then there were the humans, a species that had come from the fringes of the galaxy to become a crucial part of this new power structure. Hawk stepped forward, feeling the weight of leadership. "Thank you all for coming," she began. "Today marks a turning point for our civilizations. We have fought side by side to end a long and devastating war. Now, we must work together to ensure that it never happens again." The murmurs in the room grew quieter. Admiral Kor of the Draneth nodded. "We cannot forget our past, but we also cannot let it dictate our future. We have seen the strength that comes from unity." Captain Queller of the Exilorians added, "We must build a coalition that values cooperation over conflict. We have the chance to create something unprecedented in this galaxy." Hawk sensed the energy shift in the room. Hope was blossoming. "Let's discuss the new council that will govern our coalition. It is crucial that we establish equal representation from all three races." She proposed. As discussions unfolded, they focused on several key areas: military cooperation, trade agreements, and shared technology. Each aspect was vital to ensuring that peace would flourish. The representatives worked tirelessly, each contributing their knowledge. The Draneth offered their strategic military insights, while the Exilorians shared their advancements in technology. The humans, known for their creativity and innovation, proposed new ways to integrate these ideas. Days turned into weeks, and the council began to take shape. A new capital was established on Zenthara, a planet that represented neutrality and cooperation. It became the heart of their alliance, symbolizing hope for a brighter future. The first major initiative was a combined military force known as the Galactic Defense Alliance, GDA. This new force would ensure that any threat, external or internal, could be met with a united front. Hawk was appointed as the first commander of this alliance, a role that filled her with both pride and responsibility. "We will train together, learn from each other, and become a single unit," she declared at the first meeting of the GDA. "Together, we will safeguard our homes and our people." The representatives nodded in agreement. They understood the importance of this alliance. It was not just about power. It was about protection and trust. As the GDA began training exercises, something remarkable happened. Humans, Draenith, and Exilorians worked side by side, forging bonds that transcended their differences. The once feared enemies now shared meals, stories, and laughter. They discovered that they had more in common than they had thought. Hawk watched as a group of young soldiers from each race trained together. A Draenith warrior helped a Exilorian improve her combat skills, while a human shared techniques from their unique training methods. They encouraged each other, breaking down barriers and building friendships. The morale was high, and with it came newfound confidence. Together, they were no longer just individual races, they were a unified force. Amid the celebrations of their progress, a shadow loomed. Rumors spread of a group of Draenith extremists who were not pleased with the peace treaty. They believed that the Draenith should not trust the humans or Exilorians. The threat of renewed conflict was real, and Hawk knew that they had to act swiftly.